In the dark labyrinth of true crime, some cases stand out not for their simplicity, but for the terrifying complexity of their motives. They show us that evil often does not reside in grotesque-looking monsters, but nestles behind benevolent smiles and a faith that is, in truth, a facade. This is the criminal file of Flordelis, a story that began as a gospel fairy tale and ended as a nightmare of blood, poison, and limitless ambition. A narrative where the mother of more than 50 children, a pastor and congresswoman, orchestrated the murder of her own husband, revealing that the perfect family was, in reality, a criminal organization dressed in virtue. Before the blood stained the garage floor, before the name Flordelis became synonymous with infamy, there was a careful construction, a public persona sculpted with surgical precision. Flordelis dos Santos de Sousa was not just any figure. She was a product of personal and religious marketing, an icon that captivated Brazil. Her image was omnipresent. She was the successful gospel singer, whose hymns echoed in thousands of churches, touching the hearts of the faithful. She was the charismatic evangelical pastor, whose sermons were received as divine words, capable of healing and redeeming. And at the peak of her influence, she became a federal congresswoman for Rio de Janeiro, carrying her persona from the pulpits to the halls of power in Brasilia. But the foundation of this entire empire of fame and fortune was a single powerful pillar, the narrative of the saintly matriarch, the woman with a giant heart who had opened her doors, and her love to adopt 55 children and adolescents, rescuing them from situations of extreme vulnerability. This story of altruism was so powerful that in 2009, it was immortalized on film. The movie Flordelis, Just One Word to Change was not just a biography. It was the consecration of a myth, solidifying in the popular imagination the figure of a modern saint generating an incalculable financial return and image capital. At the center of this vast family structure was a man, Pastor Anderson de Carmo de Souza. He was much more than a husband. He was the administrative brain, the iron-fisted manager behind the Flordelis empire. Anderson tightly controlled every cent, every investment, every financial decision of the couple and the religious ministry they led. And here, a peculiarity that already carried within it the germ of tragedy. The dynamic between Flordelis and Anderson was, in itself, atypical. Before becoming her husband and the manager of her wealth, Anderson had been her adoptive son. This transition from son to spouse added a disturbing layer of complexity and control to a relationship that, as the investigation would reveal, was more of a business than a marriage. The carefully constructed facade crumbled brutally and spectacularly in the early hours of June 16, 2019. In the garage of the couple's home in Pendatiba, Niterói, Pastor Anderson de Carmo was executed. The violence was excessive, disproportionate. His body was hit by more than 30 shots from a large-caliber firearm. The scene was one of carnage. In front of the cameras, a tearful Flordelis presented the version she would try to sell to the world, a robbery turned murder, a violent mugging that ended in tragedy. She painted a picture of cruel invaders and a random loss. But the investigators from the Homicide Police Department of Niterói, São Gonçalo, and Itaboraí didn't buy the story. Their sharp instincts detected that something was profoundly wrong. The absence of signs of forced entry, the precision of the ambush, the absurd number of shots. Everything screamed that this crime was personal. The robbery hypothesis was quickly discarded, and the pieces of the macabre puzzle began to fit together, revealing a shocking family conspiracy. The investigation exposed that the vast family of 55 children was not just a domestic arrangement, it was the main asset of the Flordelis brand. It was what sold records, packed churches, and got her elected as a congresswoman. And the crime revealed how this same structure, which seemed an example of love, was transformed into a lethal weapon. At least 7 of her children and 1 granddaughter were directly implicated in the plot. The motivation, according to the public prosecutor's office, was primitive and powerful: control over money and power. Anderson, with his centralized management, was the obstacle. Flordelis and some of her closest children longed for unrestricted access to the cash flow. The solution, in the matriarch's mind, was elimination. Family loyalty was corrupted, transformed into blind obedience to a mastermind who wore the clothes of a spiritual leader. The reconstruction of the crime night revealed a meticulous plan. The couple returned home around 4 o'clock in the morning after an event. They went up to the bedroom, but Anderson said he needed to go back to the garage to get something from the car. It was the exact moment for the trap to be sprung. As he went down the stairs and entered the garage, he was met by the shooters. The execution was relentless. The 30 projectiles that pierced his body were fired mainly from a 9mm pistol. Many of the shots were concentrated in his pelvic region, a detail that for investigators suggested hatred, humiliation, and a passionate component behind the financial motive. To conceal their identities, the perpetrators wore balaclavas, a clear sign of premeditation. The justice system, after a long trial, convicted Flordelis of triply qualified homicide, and each of these qualifiers exposes the heinous nature of the crime. The first was the base motive. Greed was the engine. Messages recovered from Flordelis' cell phone revealed a cold calculation. She considered divorce, but rejected it because the scandal would tarnish her public image and, consequently, her source of income. In her distorted logic, widowhood was a safer and financially more advantageous option. Her husband's life was weighed on the scales of profit and found disposable. The second qualifier was the use of a cruel method. The cruelty was attested by the disproportionate violence. 30 shots are not needed to kill. They serve to torture, to mutilate, to inflict pain. Judge Naide dos Santos Carvalho. RC highlighted in her sentence the barbaric execution and the explicit demonstration of hatred evidenced by the shots to the genital region. The third was the use of a resource that prevented the victim's defense. Anderson was killed in an ambush inside his own home, betrayed by his wife and by members of his family. The trust he placed in them was the resource that nullified any chance of reaction. The family fortress became his tomb. If the coldness of this final plan is already shocking, prepare to discover that the execution in the garage was just the climax of a much longer and more silent campaign of death. The investigations revealed that, for more than a year before the murder, the family nucleus led by Flordelis was already trying to eliminate Anderson. The initial strategy was subtle: poisoning. The idea was to simulate a death from natural causes, avoiding suspicion. There were at least 6 documented attempts to introduce poison into his food and drink. The pastor was hospitalized on multiple occasions with severe symptoms: stabbing stomach pains, uncontrollable vomiting, dizziness. The doctors, unsuspecting, treated it as gastrointestinal issues. He would return home, the epicenter of the danger, to be poisoned again. Digital evidence was crucial. On the cell phone of Simone dos Santos Rodriguez, Flordelis' biological daughter, police found a frightening search history. Cyanide in food, how to buy cyanide without a prescription. Simone was one of the direct executors of this sinister plan. When the poison repeatedly failed, the criminal organization escalated its methods. They even hired a hitman. The plan only didn't proceed because, on the scheduled day, Anderson by chance switched the car he usually used, confusing the shooter who aborted the mission. The transition from secret poison to open gunfire shows the growing impatience and desperation within the group. The need to control the money became more urgent than the fear of being discovered. For these failed attempts, Flordelis was also convicted of the crime of doubly qualified attempted homicide. After the murder, the criminal machine did not stop. A second phase began: the systematic obstruction of justice. The most blatant act was the creation of a fraudulent letter. Flordelis devised a plan for her adoptive son, Lucas Cesar dos Santos, who was already in prison, to write a letter taking sole responsibility for the crime, and most crucially, falsely implicating 2 other brothers, Misael and Luan, as the masterminds. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, sacrificing adoptive sons to protect herself and her biological son, Flavio, the actual shooter. The plot involved the help of a former military policeman, Marcos Siqueira Costa, and his wife, Andrea Santos Maya, who acted as intermediaries for a payment of 2,000 reais. This maneuver unmasked the cruel hierarchy within the Flordelis family. She was not a matriarch who loved all equally. She was a faction leader, willing to sacrifice the disposable children to protect the core children. The family was a stratified organization, where some were pawns in the Queen's power game. The obstruction didn't stop with the letter. Crucial evidence vanished. The criminals' clothes were, according to Delegate Barbara Lomba, probably incinerated in the backyard of the house, where forensics found only ashes. The cell phones of Anderson, Flordelis, and Flavio disappeared mysteriously after the crime, depriving the investigation of a wealth of information. The public prosecutor's office argued, and the jury agreed, that all these acts were not isolated. They were the operation of a structured criminal organization with a division of tasks: Flordelis, the mastermind, the leader, the financier; Flavio dos Santos, the direct executioner, sentenced to over 33 years; Simone dos Santos, co-author in planning and poisoning, sentenced to over 31 years; Lucas Cesar, the participant who bought the weapon, sentenced to 7 years and 6 months; other children and associates, sentenced for their roles in the criminal association and procedural fraud. One of the biggest obstacles was Flordelis' political power. As a federal congresswoman, she had parliamentary immunity and could not be arrested preventively. While her children fell, she used the congressional podium to declare her innocence. This barrier fell in August 2021. In a historic session, the plenary of the Chamber of Deputies revoked her mandate by 437 votes in favor and only 7 against, due to breach of parliamentary decorum. Hours later, without immunity, the police arrested her. The image of the congresswoman in handcuffs marked the end of her era of impunity. The main trial took place in November 2022. It lasted 7 days of real-life drama in the Niterói jury court. The prosecution presented robust evidence: Flavio's DNA on the murder weapon, the testimonies of children who broke the silence, the digital evidence. The defense tried, but failed to reverse the outcome. In the end, the verdict was guilty for Flordelis on all charges. The sentence was pronounced: 50 years and 28 days in a closed prison regime. In a judicial twist in April 2024, the Rio de Janeiro Court of Justice annulled the acquittals of 3 other defendants, the adoptive children Marciel, Andre, and the granddaughter Rayanne, ordering a new jury, proving that this case has not yet spoken its last word. The Flordelis case transcends true crime sensationalism. It is a case study on human nature in its darkest facet. It is a warning about the dangerous intersection of religious power, political ambition, and criminality. It unmasks the facade of the perfect family and questions the power of manipulation by charismatic leaders over their followers and, more terrifyingly, over their own family. It reveals how a narrative of charity and faith can be the veil to hide the most petty motives: the pathological pursuit of money, status, and absolute control. The fall of the matriarch was complete. From sainthood to conviction, from the spotlight to the jail cell. But the echo of her crimes, the question of how far ambition can drive a person, and the shadow she cast upon the institution of family and faith, these will continue to resonate for a long, long time. This was another case file from Real Crime Archives. Until the next story.